The mansion stood like a glowing palace at the top of the hill, its windows shining against the night sky. Expensive cars lined the driveway, polished so perfectly that the lights from the garden bounced off their bodies like diamonds. Inside, the ballroom overflowed with wealthy guests. Women in long gowns sparkled with jewels, and men in sharp black suits laughed too loudly as they lifted glasses of champagne. Music filled the air, a live band playing so fast that it almost drowned out the sound of gossip and empty compliments. Everyone was smiling, everyone was trying to look perfect. But the man at the center of it all, the billionaire himself, felt nothing but emptiness. He stood near the balcony doors with a glass in his hand, his eyes scanning the crowd without interest. People came to him with smiles that never reached their eyes. They praised his success, his business deals, his latest mansion, even his watch and shoes. He nodded politely, pretending to listen, but inside his chest was a heavy silence. They admired his wealth, but none of them cared about him. He had everything the world could offer: money, power, influence, but he had no one to share it with. Every word he heard from the guests sounded fake. Every laugh seemed too sharp. He excused himself and stepped outside onto the balcony. The cool night air touched his face, and for a brief moment he felt free. Below, the city stretched out like a sea of stars, skyscrapers glowing in the distance, cars moving like tiny insects on dark streets. He stared at it all, but even the beauty of the city did not touch his loneliness. He sighed, his breath fogging in the night, and for the first time in years, he wished he could disappear into the crowd like an ordinary man. He turned back toward the ballroom, and that was when he noticed her. In the corner of the room, hidden in the shadows where no guest bothered to look, a young maid bent down to clean broken glass. She wore a simple uniform, her hair tied back tightly, strands falling loose from hours of hard work. Her hands moved quickly as she picked up the shards, but her face told another story. Her eyes were tired, her shoulders heavy, her expression calm but full of quiet sadness. She was invisible to everyone else in the room, but not to him. For some reason, his eyes stayed on her. She was not part of the party, not part of his world, yet in that moment she was the only real thing in the room. Their eyes met for a brief second. She froze, startled to see the master of the mansion watching her. He looked away quickly, embarrassed, but the image of her face stayed in his mind. There was no greed in her eyes, no admiration for his wealth, only exhaustion and strength mixed together. It was a look he had never seen before, and it struck him in a way he could not explain. The night carried on. The guests laughed louder, the music rose higher, and champagne bottles popped open one after another. But his attention kept drifting back to her. He saw her moving through the crowd like a shadow, carrying trays of drinks, wiping tables, bending to collect empty glasses. Nobody thanked her. Nobody even noticed her. She was part of the background, just like the chandeliers and the music, unseen and unimportant. Yet every time she passed by, he felt something stir inside him, something that cut through the emptiness. At last, the party ended. The final guests left in their luxury cars, their laughter fading into the night. The servants worked quickly, cleaning the mess, stacking glasses, and picking up trash. One by one, they finished and disappeared into the staff quarters, until the mansion grew silent again. The billionaire walked slowly through the empty ballroom, his footsteps echoing against the marble floor. The air felt heavy with the ghosts of laughter and music, but he felt strangely awake, more alert than he had all evening. Near the fireplace, he saw her again. She was still working, gathering the last of the glasses into a tray. Her face looked pale under the fading light, and her movements were slower now, heavy with exhaustion. She looked up when she heard his footsteps, her eyes widening in surprise to see him still there. She lowered her gaze quickly, as if afraid of trouble. "You should rest," he said softly. She shook her head without looking at him. "There is still work left," she whispered. He stepped closer, his expensive shoes clicking against the marble. She stood, holding the tray against her chest, her small frame dwarfed by the grand room around her. He saw her hands, red from hours of scrubbing, the skin rough from endless labor. For a man used to perfect smiles and polished lives, her presence was raw, unfiltered, and it pulled him in. "I can help," he said suddenly, surprising even himself. She looked at him in shock, her lips parting slightly as if she could not believe what she heard. Then she gave a faint, bitter smile. "Men like you don't help," she said quietly. Her words stung. They were true, and he knew it. All his life, he had been served, praised, and admired, but he had never stepped into the world of people like her. Still, he wanted to prove her wrong. He reached for one of the glasses in her tray, and their fingers brushed. It was only a touch, brief and accidental, but it felt like a spark. Both of them froze. Her eyes lifted to his, and for a long moment the room seemed to fall silent. The clock ticked softly in the background, the only sound in the vast emptiness of the hall. She pulled her hand back quickly, her breathing uneven. He stood still, unable to move, unable to speak, as if the air between them had grown heavy with something neither of them could explain. It was forbidden, it was dangerous, but it was real. That night, under the silence of the mansion, something happened that neither of them had planned. A lonely billionaire, tired of his hollow world, and a maid who carried quiet strength, found themselves colliding in a secret that would change their lives forever. To him, it felt like a moment that would fade with the morning light, hidden in shadows, never spoken of again. But the truth was different. That secret night was only the beginning of a story that would one day return to haunt him in ways he could never imagine. The sun rose slowly over the city, spreading soft gold across the rooftops, but inside the mansion the morning felt strangely quiet. The grand ballroom, once filled with laughter and music, now stood empty, the air still heavy with the memory of last night's secret. The billionaire woke late, his head heavy, but not from wine, from thoughts that would not leave him. He lay in his large bed, staring at the high ceiling, replaying the moments over and over again. The maid's eyes, the touch of her hand, the silence that had wrapped around them like a hidden storm, all of it stayed with him. He told himself it had been a mistake, something that should never have happened, something that could never be spoken of. He was a man of power, a man whose life was watched by everyone, and she was a maid, someone unseen, someone whose world was far from his. He repeated these truths to himself like a shield, but the memory still burned quietly inside him. Later, as he dressed in his suit and stepped out into the halls, the mansion looked normal again. Servants moved quietly, arranging flowers, dusting tables, polishing the floor until it gleamed. They greeted him with polite bows, never meeting his eyes for more than a second. But as he walked, he noticed something strange. The maid was not there. He glanced around casually at first, expecting to see her moving silently with the others, but she was nowhere to be found. A small unease stirred in his chest. He did not ask about her. Why should he? It was not his place, not after what had happened. Still, as the hours passed, he found himself looking more often, searching the rooms, his eyes scanning every face. She was gone. By evening, he could no longer ignore it. He stopped one of the older servants and asked where she was. The woman looked nervous, her hands twisting at her apron as she said quietly, "She left, sir." He frowned. Left? The servant nodded. She did not give notice. She did not take her pay. She just disappeared. The words hit him harder than he expected. He dismissed the servant quickly, but his heart beat faster. Disappeared? Without warning? Without a word? The truth settled in his mind like a heavy stone. She had run. Run from him, from the memory, from the secret they now shared. That night, the mansion felt colder than ever. He walked through the empty halls, his footsteps echoing too loudly, the silence mocking him. In the ballroom, he stood by the fireplace where she had worked the night before. He stared at the spot where their eyes had met, where their hands had touched, and for the first time in years, he felt powerless. He had always been in control, of deals, of people, of life itself, but she had slipped away without a trace. He could not summon her back with money or orders. She was gone, and with her, the strange spark that had woken something inside him. Days turned into weeks, and still there was no sign of her. He told himself it was for the best. She had made her choice, and so had he. The night would fade, locked away as a memory hidden deep inside the mansion walls. He buried himself in work, in business meetings, in parties, in endless noise meant to drown out the quiet voice in his heart. Yet sometimes, when the city lights flickered outside his window, he thought of her again. He wondered where she had gone. Was she safe? Did she find another job? Did she ever think of him? Or had she erased him from her mind completely? He shook his head and reminded himself he was a fool. A man like him had no place in her world, and she had no place in his. Still, the unease never left him. He became sharper in his dealings, colder in his relationships, harsher with those around him. People admired his strength, but they never saw the truth, that he was building walls higher and higher to protect himself from a memory that refused to die. Behind every smile at a meeting, behind every toast at a party, behind every deal signed with a firm handshake, there was a secret, one that whispered in the dark corners of his mind. Years passed. The billionaire's empire grew larger, his fortune doubled, his name became even more powerful. But no matter how far he rose, he never forgot the maid who had vanished into the night. Her disappearance became like a shadow, always behind him, always waiting. He told himself it no longer mattered, that life had moved on, that she was only a ghost from his past. But deep down, he knew the truth. That night had not ended, it had only gone silent, waiting for the day it would return. And when it did, it would not come quietly. It would come with a force strong enough to shatter everything he had built. The years rolled by, and the billionaire's empire only grew stronger. His name appeared in newspapers, his face on magazine covers, his businesses spread across cities and nations. To the outside world, he looked untouchable, a man who had everything, power, wealth, and respect. Yet, behind the walls of his mansion, he remained haunted by silence. The maid who had disappeared after that forbidden night still lingered in his thoughts like a shadow he could never escape. Sometimes, late at night, when the house was quiet and the city lights glowed outside his windows, he wondered about her. Where had she gone? Did she ever think of him? Did she remember that night the way he did? Or had she buried it forever? He told himself it no longer mattered, that his life had moved on, but his heart never believed the lie. The unease stayed with him, quietly growing stronger with each passing year. One rainy evening, as his car rolled through the city streets, the truth returned with a force that nearly stopped his heart. The windows were tinted, the leather seats warm, the sound of the rain tapping softly against the roof. He leaned back, lost in thought, when the car slowed at a traffic light. His eyes drifted lazily toward the sidewalk, and that was when he saw her. At first, he did not believe it. The woman standing under the flickering street lamp looked thinner, older, her shoulders bent under the weight of years, but her face was one he knew too well. His chest tightened, his breath caught, and his world seemed to tilt. It was her, the maid who had vanished without a word. She stood in the cold rain, her clothes worn, her hands shaking slightly as she held out a paper cup to strangers passing by. Some ignored her, others pushed past without looking, and only a few dropped coins without stopping. She looked invisible to the world, just as she had once looked invisible in his mansion. But to him, she was a flame that burned through the darkness. Then his gaze shifted lower, and his blood ran cold. Two small children stood beside her, clutching at her dress. They were twins, no older than 6 or 7, their clothes wet and torn, their shoes thin against the rain-soaked pavement. Their faces were pale with hunger, their small hands trembling as they held onto their mother. But it was not their suffering that froze the billionaire's heart, it was their faces. He stared at them through the rain, and every part of him screamed the truth. The shape of their eyes, the curve of their chins, the stubborn set of their jaws, it was like looking into a mirror of his own childhood photographs. They looked like him. They looked too much like him. His hand tightened on the armrest, his breath coming fast, as a wave of fear, guilt, and recognition hit him all at once. The driver glanced back, asking softly if something was wrong, but the billionaire said nothing. His eyes stayed locked on the woman and the twins. She did not see him. Her eyes were fixed on the ground, her face pale with exhaustion. The children pressed against her legs, looking up at the strangers who walked past, But no one stopped, no one cared. For a moment, the billionaire thought of stepping out, of walking into the rain, of facing the truth head-on. But fear held him still. What if it was true? What if they were his children? What would the world say if they found out that the man who lived in gold and marble had children begging for scraps on the streets? The scandal would destroy him. The HOA would turn on him. The board of his company would question every decision he made. His empire could collapse under the weight of shame. The light turned green, and the car moved forward. He twisted in his seat, staring at the figures shrinking in the distance, his chest aching as if a knife had pierced through it. The rain blurred the glass, but he could still see them, the woman's tired face and the twins' wide eyes, until they disappeared into the darkness. He sat frozen, his hands trembling, his heart pounding so hard he thought it might break his ribs. His mind screamed at him to forget, to bury the sight, to pretend it had never happened. But no matter how hard he tried, the image clung to him. The woman he had once known, the children who carried his blood, standing in the rain with nothing but a paper cup between them and starvation. It was a truth he could not erase. That night, he could not sleep. He paced through the mansion's halls, his footsteps echoing, the silence louder than ever. He saw them in his mind every time he closed his eyes. The twins' faces haunted him, pulling him back to the night he had tried so hard to forget. He poured himself glass after glass of whiskey, but the burn in his throat did nothing to silence the ache in his chest. He stood by the window, staring out at the glittering city, and for the first time, all the lights looked empty, meaningless. What good was power if his own children lived in hunger? What good was wealth if the only legacy he left was shame? He pressed his hands against the glass, his reflection staring back at him, but it no longer looked like the man he thought he was. It looked hollow, broken, filled with guilt. The next evening, against his own better judgment, he returned to the same street. This time he told the driver to park farther away, and he stepped out alone, hiding in the shadows as the rain fell lightly on his shoulders. He saw her again, standing in the same place, holding the same cup, the twins by her side. His chest tightened as he watched her bend down to comfort them, giving them what little food she had managed to collect, even though it meant she went without. His heart ached at the sight, but his feet would not move. He stood frozen, a coward trapped between fear of the truth and the pull of love he could not deny. He turned away at last, walking back to his car with heavy steps, but he knew he could not keep watching forever. The truth had already caught him, and no matter how hard he tried to run, it would find him again. The billionaire returned to his mansion that night, but peace did not follow him. He walked through the vast halls, past golden frames, polished marble, and glittering chandeliers, yet none of it gave him comfort. His footsteps echoed too loudly, reminding him that the mansion, despite all its beauty, was nothing more than an empty cage. He sat in his study, a glass of whiskey untouched on the table, and pressed his hands to his face. The image of the woman in the rain would not leave him. He saw her tired eyes, the lines of struggle across her face, the way she pulled the twins close to her as if protecting them from the cruelty of the world. But it was the children's faces that broke him the most. Their eyes so much like his own, their small expressions carrying a resemblance he could not deny. Every time he blinked, he saw them again, and each time his chest tightened as if the truth itself was crushing him. Could it really be? Could those children belong to him? The question chased him like a ghost, and no matter how he tried to bury it, it rose again, whispering in the dark corners of his mind. The days that followed became unbearable. He tried to focus on his work, drowning himself in meetings, signing contracts, and shaking hands with people who praised his success. But their words felt hollow, their faces blurred, because behind every moment of false glory he saw the twins standing in the rain. He drove through the city again and again, unable to stop himself, parking his car at a distance, watching from the shadows like a man trapped between two worlds. Sometimes he saw her begging, her face pale and her shoulders hunched. Sometimes he saw her comforting the children with scraps of bread, feeding them first before taking a bite herself. And sometimes he saw them asleep on the sidewalk, their small bodies curled together for warmth while the world walked past without care. Each time, the guilt grew heavier. He told himself to turn away, to leave them, to forget, but his heart refused to listen. At night, the war inside him grew louder. Pride screamed that he must protect his reputation. He had built an empire on strength, control, and image. If the truth came out, it would all collapse. The HOA would whisper behind his back. The neighbors would treat him as a scandal. The board of his company would question his leadership, and the newspapers would devour his secret. In his world, mistakes were not forgiven. Weakness was not allowed. But guilt whispered louder still, reminding him that no matter how high his walls were, they could not hide the truth. Those children carried his blood, and with every breath they took, his silence became another betrayal. He paced the halls of his mansion late into the night, torn between two futures, one where he stayed hidden, safe in his pride, and one where he stepped into the light and claimed what was his, no matter the cost. Fear became his constant companion. He feared the truth, feared the woman's anger, feared the children's innocent questions. How could he look into their eyes and explain why he had not been there all these years? How could he tell them he had lived in luxury while they starved on the streets? He imagined their voices, their confusion, their tears, and the thought twisted his stomach into knots. He told himself perhaps it was too late, perhaps they did not need him, perhaps the kindest thing would be to leave them alone. Yet every time he tried to convince himself, the memory of their faces returned, and he knew he could not turn away. The doubt gnawed at him, the fear clawed at him, but his heart refused to let go. One evening, as he stood once more in the shadows of the street, watching them beg under the weak glow of a flickering lamp, he felt his knees weaken. The children's small voices reached his ears as they asked their mother if they could eat soon. She smiled at them softly, hiding her pain, and told them not to worry, but he saw the tears in her eyes. His throat closed as he realized she had carried this burden alone for years, while he had lived surrounded by comfort. For the first time, he hated himself, not for weakness, not for failure in business, but for the silence that had allowed this suffering to exist. He wanted to step forward, to walk to her, to say the words that burned in his chest. But doubt stopped him once more. What if she rejected him? What if she told him the children were his and then turned her back, saying he had no right to them after abandoning her? The thought tore through him, and he froze in place. That night, he returned to his mansion, but the silence was unbearable. He sat in front of the mirror, staring at his reflection, and saw not a powerful man but a coward afraid of the truth. His hands shook as he gripped the edge of the table, and he whispered into the darkness, "What have I done?" His voice broke, echoing back at him like a confession he could not escape. Pride told him to bury it, to forget, to let the world stay blind. But his heart knew the truth was already alive, and no lie could kill it. The battle within him grew fiercer, and he knew the time was coming when he would have to decide. Would he remain silent and let his children suffer, or would he face the truth and risk losing everything he had built? The billionaire could no longer live with the silence, and after so many sleepless nights, he finally found himself standing once again on that broken street corner, the rain dripping from his coat as he watched her and the twins from a few steps away. His heart pounded as if it wanted to break free from his chest, and his palms were damp with sweat despite the cold air. The children were sitting close to her, their little hands cupped together as they held the coins a stranger had dropped. She stroked their hair gently, whispering to them with a soft smile, though he could see in her eyes the exhaustion of a life that had offered her nothing but struggle. At last, unable to bear the weight anymore, he stepped forward. She noticed him immediately. Her body stiffened, her hand tightening protectively on the twins, her eyes narrowing with suspicion and fear. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The sounds of the city, horns, footsteps, and raindrops, seemed to fade into silence. Finally, he forced the words out, though his voice trembled. "Are they mine?" Her lips parted, her eyes filled with anger and pain, and for a long moment she said nothing. The twins looked up at her with innocent curiosity, not understanding the storm between the adults. She drew in a shaky breath, and then, slowly, she nodded. "Yes," she said softly, her voice low but sharp enough to cut through him. "They are yours." The words struck him like thunder. His legs felt weak, his vision blurred, and for a moment the world spun. He looked at the children again, and this time there was no room left for doubt. He saw himself in their faces, in their stubborn chins, in the way their eyes carried a fire he once had as a boy. His chest tightened with guilt so heavy it nearly crushed him. "You should have told me," he whispered. But even as he said it, he knew the truth. She shook her head, her expression turning hard, her voice rising. "Told you?" she repeated, her words trembling with years of held-back pain. "And what then? You would have denied it. You would have sent me away. You would have hidden us to protect your name, your pride, your empire. I left because I refused to let my children grow up as a shameful secret in your golden cage." Her words burned him, each one a truth he could not deny. He lowered his gaze, unable to meet her eyes, ashamed of the man he had been. The twins tugged at her dress, asking softly who he was, and her voice caught as she whispered, "No one. Just a man who once belonged to another life." The billionaire's heart broke at those words. To his children, he was nothing, just another stranger on the street, while in his veins ran their blood. He knelt slowly, lowering himself to their level, his eyes filling with tears he had never allowed himself to shed before. "I am sorry," he said, his voice cracking. "I should have been here. I should have been your father." But the children only blinked at him, confused, too young to understand the weight of his words. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his wallet, his hands trembling as he offered her money. But she pushed it back firmly, her eyes blazing with defiance. "I never wanted your money," she hissed. "If I had wanted that, I could have destroyed you years ago. All I wanted was to protect them, from your world, from your lies, from your pride." The rejection cut deeper than he expected. He had spent his whole life believing money could solve everything. But here, standing before the mother of his children, he realized money meant nothing. She had carried the burden alone, not because she was weak, but because she was strong enough to choose dignity over wealth. For a long time, they stood in silence, the rain dripping down their faces, the twins shifting restlessly between them. At last, her eyes softened just slightly, and she spoke again, her voice low and tired. "You cannot undo the years you missed. You cannot erase the hunger they felt, the nights they cried for food, the days I gave them scraps while I went without. But if you truly mean to stand here, if you truly mean to fight for them now, then show me. Prove to me this is not another lie, another game. Because if you hurt them, if you walk away again, I will never forgive you." His throat tightened, his heart pounding, but he nodded firmly. "I will prove it," he said, his voice steady despite the storm inside him. "Not with money, not with words, but with my life." She studied him for a moment, searching his eyes for weakness, for pride, for the man she remembered. And though she still carried doubt, she also saw something new, something that had not been there years ago. Regret. Honesty. A crack in the walls he had built so high. Slowly, she nodded, not in forgiveness but in reluctant acceptance. The children tugged at her hand again, and she guided them away, her back straight, her head high, leaving him standing alone in the rain. He watched them go, his heart aching with both shame and hope. The truth had been revealed, and though it had shattered him, it also gave him something he had not felt in years, a chance. As the rain fell harder, soaking through his expensive coat, he realized that nothing in his empire, no mansion, no car, no deal, had ever mattered as much as the two small faces he had just seen. His life would never be the same again, because the truth had finally broken free, and it would not let him go. The billionaire returned to his mansion that night, but nothing looked the same anymore. The chandeliers still glowed, the marble floors still shined, and the gardens outside still stretched wide and perfect under the lights, yet the house felt darker than ever. He walked through the empty halls like a man lost, his footsteps echoing in silence that pressed heavy against his chest. He entered his study and sat in the large leather chair, but the comfort that once gave him pride now felt like a trap. On the desk before him lay documents worth millions, business contracts that could change the course of entire markets, but his eyes saw only two small faces reflected in the polished wood. The truth had been spoken, and it clung to him like chains. Those children were his, and he had abandoned them without even knowing it. He poured himself a drink, his hands trembling, but the sharp burn in his throat did nothing to quiet the storm inside. Pride shouted at him to bury it, to protect his name, to silence the scandal before it reached the ears of the world. But guilt screamed louder, telling him that no matter how carefully he guarded his image, he was already exposed, not to the public, but to himself. He paced back and forth, his mind torn in two. In one world, he could keep his secret hidden. He could pay the woman off, ensure she disappeared again, and return to his perfect image of power and wealth. That was the path his advisors would expect, the path the board of his company would demand, the path the HOA would whisper about with cold approval. It was safe, it was clean, but it was also empty, and it would crush whatever soul he had left. In the other world, he could step forward, accept the children as his own, and face the storm that would surely follow. The scandal would be fierce, the whispers endless, and his empire might shake beneath the weight of it. But for the first time, he would live in truth. His heart pounded as he imagined both futures, each step heavy with fear. That night, he could not sleep. He walked the mansion like a restless ghost, through the library, the ballroom, even the balcony where years ago he had first noticed her working quietly in the shadows. The memory struck him like a blade, the way her eyes had met his, the way her hands had trembled, the way silence had bound them together in a moment he thought would be forgotten. But it had not been forgotten. It had grown, it had lived, and now it stood on the streets with faces that looked just like his. He leaned against the railing, staring out at the city, and whispered into the cold air, "What kind of man am I?" The city gave him no answer, only the sound of distant traffic and the whistle of the wind. 4 days, the battle consumed him. At work, he found himself distracted, his mind drifting from meetings to memories. At dinners, he barely touched his food, his thoughts trapped in guilt. Even during parties, surrounded by laughter and flashing lights, he felt like a man trapped behind glass, watching a life that no longer belonged to him. His advisors noticed his silence, whispering among themselves, but none dared to ask. Only he knew the war that burned inside his chest, a war between the life he had built and the life he owed. At night, he drove back to the streets, unable to resist the pull. He parked in the shadows, hiding from sight, and watched them from a distance. He saw the way she comforted the twins when they cried, the way she gave them food even when it meant she went hungry, the way she held them close when the wind grew cold. He felt shame twist inside him with every passing moment. He had spent his nights in silk sheets and gold halls while they had spent theirs in hunger and fear. He clenched his fists until his knuckles turned white, anger rising not at her, but at himself. And yet, fear remained. What if he claimed them and the world rejected him? What if the woman refused to forgive him? What if the children grew to hate him for his absence? He pictured their small voices asking why he had not been there, their eyes filling with tears, and his chest burned with a pain deeper than any he had felt before. He told himself it might be easier to leave them, that perhaps they were safer without him. But even as the thought crossed his mind, he knew it was a lie. His blood ran through their veins, and no matter how far he tried to run, the truth had already caught him. One evening, as he stood in the shadows watching again, the twins laughed at something small, perhaps a joke, perhaps a raindrop falling into the cup they held, and the sound pierced through him like sunlight breaking through clouds. It was pure, innocent, and it reminded him of what life was supposed to be. He realized then that he could not walk away. Pride had guided his life for too long, but pride could not raise children. Pride could not fill their stomachs, or give them warmth, or protect them from the cruel world. Only love could, and though he was late, though he was flawed, though he was terrified, he knew he had to try. He returned to his mansion that night, his face pale, his hands steady at last. He looked at his reflection in the mirror, the face of a man who had been feared, admired, envied, but never truly known. Now he saw something else in his eyes. Not strength, not wealth, but the beginning of courage. The battle inside him was not over, but the choice was becoming clear. He could no longer live behind lies. He would have to face the truth, no matter how high the cost. And for the first time, he was ready to pay it. The rumors began spreading faster than he expected. Whispers carried from one mansion to another, from garden parties to board meetings, until even the most polished smiles in the neighborhood seemed to hide quiet judgment. For years the billionaire had been the pride of the community, the shining example of success, the man people pointed to when they spoke of power and perfection. But now that image was cracking. The HOA board, always obsessed with order and appearances, wasted no time in calling him to a private meeting. It was held in the community hall, a room lined with paintings of neat lawns and spotless houses, the very image of a world where flaws were not allowed. He walked inside with steady steps, though his chest carried the weight of fear and anger both. Around the long table sat the board members, men and women with sharp eyes and polished clothes, their smiles stiff as they waited for him to sit. He lowered himself into the chair at the head of the table, and silence fell heavy in the room, broken only by the ticking of the clock on the wall. Finally, the head of the board spoke, his voice calm but edged with warning. "We have heard disturbing stories," he said, his hands folded neatly on the table. "Stories about a woman and 2 children. Stories that, if true, could bring shame not only on you but on this community as a whole." The words struck like a blade, but the billionaire did not flinch. He had expected this. The other members joined in one after another, their voices polite but filled with judgment. One woman leaned forward and said the gossip was already spreading among neighbors, and if it reached the press, it would become a scandal. Another man suggested he must take care of the situation quietly, before it ruined the image they all worked so hard to protect. Some spoke of reputation, others of control, but all of them made it clear that the truth he carried was not welcome in their perfect world. For years he had listened to their voices, obeyed their rules, played the part they demanded of him. But as he sat there now, staring at their cold faces, something inside him hardened. He thought of the woman standing in the rain, of the twins clutching her dress with hungry eyes, of the laughter he had heard in their small voices despite the hardship around them, and he felt anger rise like fire in his chest. When the head of the board finished, asking him directly if the stories were true, he leaned forward slowly, his eyes burning with defiance. "Yes," he said, his voice steady, heavy with weight. "They are true." The room froze. Some gasped quietly, others exchanged shocked looks, and the silence that followed was thick enough to choke on. He continued before they could speak, his tone sharper now. "Those children are mine. They carry my blood, and I will not deny them." The words rang through the hall like thunder, shaking the false perfection off the walls. For a moment, no one knew what to say. Then the head of the board slammed his hand on the table, his voice rising. "Do you understand what this means? Do you understand the damage this will cause? You are risking everything, your company, your reputation, this community." But the billionaire stood, his chair scraping loudly against the floor, and for the first time in years, he felt stronger than them. "I have risked nothing compared to what they have lost," he said firmly. "I have lived in comfort while they starved. I have lived in luxury while they begged. And if this community cannot accept the truth, then perhaps it is not worth belonging to." The board members shifted uneasily, some whispering, some glaring, but none dared to challenge him further. They had expected him to bow, to protect his image, to bury the truth under money and lies, but instead he stood taller than ever, defying them with honesty. "Do what you must," he told them, his voice echoing. "Take away my place here, drag my name through your meetings, whisper behind my back. I no longer care. I will not hide my family, not from you, not from anyone." With that, he turned and walked toward the doors, his footsteps loud in the silence. He could feel their eyes on him, full of shock, anger, and fear, but he did not look back. For once in his life, he was not walking away from truth, he was walking toward it. When he stepped outside, the night air hit his face, cold and sharp, but it felt like freedom. He had faced them, the guardians of appearances, the keepers of perfection, and he had not broken. The battle was not over, the whispers would grow louder, the media might soon come knocking, and his empire could shake under the weight of the truth. But his heart felt lighter than it had in years. For the first time, he had spoken openly, without fear, without lies. The HOA could keep their polished streets and their shallow rules. He had something far greater waiting for him. He thought of the twins' laughter, the way they had clung to their mother,